Welcome to Anatomy and Physiology. I'm glad you're here. I'm looking forward to a great semester. Let's get started. So the class is called Anatomy and Physiology, but from the beginning, we need to differentiate between what do those two different terms mean. So anatomy is referring to the structure or the form. It comes from the Greek word anatomy, which means to cut apart or to dissect. And we can refer to anatomy either in the microscopic form or the macroscopic. So we can look at structures as small as cells and look at the form and the structure of those cells. That's called cytology. Cells come together to make tissues, and if we look at tissues under the microscope, then we're looking at what we would call that's called histology. At the macroscopic level or gross anatomy, those are larger structures, organs or body systems. And we can look at those in different ways. So in this class, we will talk about different systemic anatomy, meaning body systems. So we'll cover the integumentary system, the muscular system, the skeletal system, and the nervous system in AMP1. We can also look at the structures or anatomy based on a regional area. So we might say, let's look at all of the anatomy in the abdominal cavity. Surface anatomy, which we'll talk about as we go through the semester, is looking at different surface features. It might be a bony feature or something else that serves as an important landmark to indicate maybe the presence of a structure or an organ deep to that surface feature. Now, pathology, you've probably heard the term. This refers to changes in structure or changes in anatomy because of the presence of disease. So the word pathos means disease. Now, if we take the partner to anatomy, physiology, this is when we're interested in the function. So we have the structure in anatomy. Now, what does it do? What's the function of that structure? That's the physiology piece. And an important part of physiology is maintaining homeostasis in our body. We'll have another lecture where we talk specifically about homeostasis. So we could talk about physiology at the cellular, even the molecular level. So the function of proteins, the movement of molecules in and out of cells, obviously the function of different tissues, and at the level of organ or organ system. We can look at the physiology of a particular body system. So I mentioned in this class we'll cover the muscular system, the skeletal system, but obviously our cardiovascular system, our respiratory system, all of those have specific functions that they carry out. So that would be their physiology. Now, we talked about pathology refers to when there is an issue or a problem with the structure or the anatomy because of disease. So pathophysiology is when the disease actually is causing a problem with the function of that structure or organ system. Now, the cool thing about anatomy and physiology is that they are related. So form and function are related. The structure of something is there because of the type of function that it carries out. They complement one another. So when you're looking at structure, it gives you an idea of what that is how it's going to function. So a couple of examples of this, which we'll see this throughout the entire semester, is in veins, we have one-way blood flow because of valves that are present. And I'm going to show you a little more in the next slide about that. But another example is something as simple as bone tissue has minerals that are deposited so that it makes it become hard. And that's because the purpose or the function of bone tissue is for structure, right? And to protect our internal organs. Now, this is an example of an artery, a capillary, and a vein. Now, they're all part of the cardiovascular system. There's blood flowing through all three of these. However, they have different structures, and their structures have something to do with their function. So an artery, we can see right away that the artery has a pretty thick layer of skeletal muscle, or smooth muscle there. And the reason that it needs that thicker layer of muscle is because as the blood is flowing through the artery is closer to the heart than the capillary or the vein. So there's more blood pressure that's exerted on the artery. So that smooth muscle is there because of the blood pressure. Notice that the capillary has a very thin wall. And that's because the purpose of a capillary is to allow molecules to diffuse across the capillary wall into cells and tissues, and then for waste to diffuse from the cells and tissue into the capillary. So the thin wall is important because we need diffusion to occur. The vein, on the other hand, it's going to have, which aren't shown here, valves that are present that will allow blood to only flow one direction. Because if you think about it, blood in your feet and your legs still has to make its way against gravity back up to your heart. And therefore, the valves prevent the blood from going back down into your feet. So the structure of these is different because the function of them is different. Now, all living things have certain characteristics. We call these characteristics of life. And I'm going to talk about these especially as it relates to humans, because this class is an anatomy and physiology class related to us, right? Humans. So we have organization. When you look at the way our bodies are formed, we start with the smallest atom. These atoms come together to form molecules, which then come together to form organelles and cells and tissues and organs and organ systems, and finally an organism. All of this is very ordered and organized. Metabolism, you may be familiar with this term. You may use it sort of to mean how many calories you're burning versus how much you eat as far as it relates to diet or weight gain or weight loss. In this class and in science, metabolism really means the sum of all the chemical reactions that are occurring in a cell. We'll talk about that in the next slide. Now, we know, because we observe it, that when a baby is born, the baby grows, but not just grows in size, but develops, right? We see brain maturation, their ability to walk, their ability to do things that they weren't able to do before. So not just growth, but also development. Responsiveness. What this means is the ability to react to stimuli. So this is as simple as if I put my hand on the hot burner, I'm going to jerk it back, right? Because those receptors tell my nervous system that's hot, and then my nervous system sends a signal and tells the muscles in my arm to remove my hand. Homeostasis. We're going to have an entire lecture video about homeostasis. It's an important concept. We have many things in our body systems that need to be within a certain healthy range. And so we have to have a way to regulate that to keep ourselves healthy. Now, without reproduction, our species would die out, right? So we have to have a way to reproduce. Now, I mentioned to you organization is one of the characteristics of life. So this is just walking through what I mentioned, where the smallest level that we're going to look at is atoms. So this is the chemical level. And if atoms are really the smallest we can divide matter into, right? And so we have hydrogen atoms as an example, oxygen atom is an example. Those can come together, hydrogen and oxygen, to form water. So atoms then come together to form molecules. So an example of a molecule would be water. We're made of mostly water, so that's a good thing. We also can have much larger molecules like proteins, carbohydrates. Those are all formed by atoms. Now, molecules will then come together to form organelles. These are structures inside of our cells that carry out certain functions. You could think of it like a mini organ. And then organelles come together with other molecules to form cells. And the cell is what we would consider the smallest unit that is living. So below a cell, those are not considered living. Now, similar groups of cells will come together to form tissues. And there are 4 different types of body tissues that we'll cover in a later lesson. And then tissues come together to form an organ. So in this case, we see a bladder as the organ that's formed by smooth muscle tissue and some epithelial tissue. And then we have organs come together to form an entire body system or organ system. In this case, it's the urinary tract system. So we have the bladder in combination with the kidneys and the ureters and the urethra to allow us to expel our nitrogenous waste. Then the organ systems obviously come together to form the entire organism. So that's just an example of one of those characteristics of life, organization. Now, I mentioned to you that metabolism means all the type of chemical reactions that are going on in the cell. There are two types of chemical reactions that I want you to know, and that's catabolic reactions and anabolic reactions. These are opposite. Catabolic reactions take larger molecules, break them down into smaller molecules, and through that process, energy is released. Anabolic reactions are the opposite. These are building up larger molecules from smaller molecules, therefore it requires an input of energy. Both types of reactions are going on in the cell. So think about when you eat a meal, the food goes through your digestive system and it's broken down into smaller molecules, and you use that as to produce energy so that you can carry out work, cellular work. In order for cells to do work, by work I mean produce molecules, move molecules, for your muscle cells to contract, anything like that happening, they have to spend currency, energy currency. And the energy currency of your cell is called adenosine triphosphate, or for short ATP. So what do I mean by currency? Well, if I want to go to the grocery store and buy groceries, I need money, right? That's my currency. Or to get gasoline, I need money. That's my currency. The cell spends ATP in order to move molecules, produce molecules, contract a muscle.